Hi, everybody, and welcome to Adobe Live. My name is Flynn. Very excited to be with you this morning, and I'm here with Jeremy Lord. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing?
Hey Flynn, how are you guys going? Good to be here again.
Thanks for waking up with us. Hi, everybody in chat. Hello, Malik. Hello, D. Great to see you. Hey, Johanna. Great to see you there. Sam, good to see you as well. Moto, this should be fire. Yes, it should be fire. No pressure, Jeremy. We've got we've got the beginning of a series here today. So what we've been chatting about a little bit over here behind the scenes has been some getting started sort of programming around either apps or certain particular fields. And every time we do a stream with Jeremy, there are so many questions that we have about how to get started around some kind of fundamentals and things like that. So we thought we would dedicate a couple of episodes to focusing and really doubling down on that. So the idea is that you can start here and then we'll build up. So build up in confidence and experience, and we'll cover as many things as we can during that time. So Jeremy, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, cool. I'm super excited for these. We usually do these things where it's like talking about like what I do specifically, and there are sort of heaps of questions and tips and tricks, but they can be a little bit more specific to like this is how you like draw and illustrate like me.
Mm.
So it's really good to kind of change a pace to look into something a little bit more broad and kind of down to basics and illustrations. So what we'll cover over the next 4 weeks um, is just the sort of basic things that you'll need for illustrating using Photoshop. And a little bit of a sketchbook as well, still kind of based a little bit in the real world, but predominantly using Photoshop across a range of different kind of tools and methods to, yeah, essentially, like Flynn said, get you started.
Yeah, and I think also, often when we're planning the content, we're planning about 2 hours on here, and we have a kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. So obviously, we love the interaction, but we sometimes will need to move on fairly quickly just to make sure that we do kind of complete the task. But our task now is just to teach and get a bit of interaction as well. So if there's something that kind of comes up that you want us to double down on, whether we can cover it in this episode or one of the future episodes, then this is the perfect environment to do so. Hi, got Amanda in the chat as well. Anthony, great to see you. Great questions the other day. Thanks for those as well. And Neil, great to see you. Chris, that's awesome. Hey, from India, that's great. Good to see you from India. That's fantastic.
Awesome.
And so someone mentioned the schedule. So yeah, I'm just going to pop over to our sadly static schedule today because there's so much going on this week here at Adobe Live, like Australian edition, that I couldn't fit it in to the After Effects file in time. So this is actually what we're doing this week. Yesterday we did Getting Started with Premiere Pro. That's a series that's going to go for a couple of weeks. Thanks to everybody in chat that joined that. We are here on Wednesday. We're getting started in illustration with Jeremy Lord, which will be a series as well. Tomorrow, sketch party with Bianca Beers, and right after that, we've got illustration with Alex Lahores, who I actually met through you, Jeremy, and he is
Yeah.
doing his Adobe Live working from home debut. So I'm very excited to hang out with Alex. Got a fun story about the first time we were planning on doing an Adobe Live together. Um, and then on Friday, creative photography editing with Demis Rosalie. And then on Saturday, we're editing in Lightroom with Ichiban or Benjamin Lee. So tune into that to see how well I'm surviving, because yeah, I'm hosting all of those. Um,
Wow.
I'm super excited about it. There's so much stuff. We don't have enough days to kind of get through everything. But we are here today with Jeremy Lord, getting started in illustration. So in terms of format, feel free to ask questions as we go. I'll hand over to Jeremy in a moment. We will have our typical break at the middle, so our typical kind of Q&A break in the middle. If there are anything that we want to kind of dig into, it's very likely that's probably going to be an interactive, how do you do that, why do you do this kind of sort of thing. But you can ask anything you like, and it gives us a little bit of a break in the middle, so don't hesitate to ask your questions as we go. But Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds good. That is a very, very packed week. I think by the end of this week, Flynn, you might be sort of grandmaster Flash creative of all the different things.
I'm good at talking about it, but I don't know about doing it. We'll see.
So I'll just run through quickly what these 4 sessions will kind of look like in the broad strokes. Again, as you mentioned, I think one of the things that's always really cool when we do this is like questions that happen on the fly. So I've got kind of a structure of a plan for today and the next 3 weeks, but if you guys want to throw some questions in to kind of, switch things up a little bit, that's always really kind of fun as well. So please don't hesitate to do that. So today we're going to look at really the most basic things, which is painting and drawing, creating brushes in Photoshop. We're going to start with a basic sketch. So an actual like real world pencil with real world paper sketch. And we might talk about image sizes and all those kind of things as well. Next week, we're going to start sort of applying colors and using selection tools. So again, really the peas and carrots of Photoshop, looking at sort of working with layers and all those kind of ideas. Then we're going to look at something else, which is more kind of the genesis of Photoshop, which is photo collage and assembly, still in illustration. So we'll look at sort of, composing images, blending modes, using different assets that haven't necessarily been drawn in Photoshop, but how do we kind of compose that and then blend it in seamlessly in Photoshop? And then the 4th session will be a little bit about my style and what I do specifically, and then we can kind of do a bit of a review and final questions. If anybody's missed one of these 3 sessions, session 4 will be the time to do that. So yes, just a quick run through of the 4 sessions and how they'll develop.
Yeah, awesome.
So without further ado, I think we just jump straight in. So again, we're going to be looking exclusively at Photoshop today. We might jump into Illustrator a couple of times in the next few sessions, but today is going to be all about Illustrator. So, Photoshop. So Photoshop, starting at the very, very basics. Starting with the super basics, obviously if you've never kind of opened Photoshop, this is what it looks like. The first thing you need to do is create a new document. So we're just going to create new. This is probably a good opportunity as well to talk about keyboard shortcuts. So every one of Adobe's programs comes with baked-in keyboard shortcuts, which you can edit. You can change depending on what your comfort is. So I won't necessarily talk too much about that because that's a whole kind of chapter in itself. But you can edit those. We're just going to start with a basic A4. We're doing art and illustration. There's a bunch of different things here. We're just going to go with print and we're going to go with A4. I'll talk about all these settings in a tick, but I'm keen to just kind of get started with some illustration before we go into it. And then we're just going to hit create, and that opens up a canvas. And this is what your kind of workspace may look like. So there's a bunch of different workspaces that you can arrange depending on what you're doing. So Photoshop has got a broad range of different things that you can do with it. And basically it's kind of like the go-to program for pretty much anything creative. You can do some typing. You obviously can do photography, as you guys will see with Demis, using a lot of Photoshop and kind of all that aspect of it. And obviously you can do illustration and painting as well. So depending on what you're trying to do, you're going to need different windows open in different workspaces. I generally just work, if you go into Window, Workspace, you can see here there's 3D motion. You can do animated GIFs as well. Photography, web design. I just usually just run with Essentials defaults. And then any other panels that I need to open as I go will just be open. But important for you guys to set up your kind of your workspace the way you want it to, because that's what's going to be the most comfortable. So let's dive straight in. I'm going to start.
We got a great question really early on. So why do most illustrators use Photoshop instead of Illustrator?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think there's a lot of concept artists will definitely use Photoshop over Illustrator. a lot of illustrators do use Illustrator though. So there's a bit of a distinction to be made, I think, in between an artist and an illustrator. So technically, if you want to be kind of fussy about it, they're the same thing. But an artist is like a street artist, for instance. They are also illustrators, and they will work like that. So, for instance, somebody like Alex Lahurs is a street artist, and he uses paints and spray cans and all that when he's doing a mural, and then he'll jump into Illustrator when he's working on professional commission. So, generally, the difference here, and I'm generalizing massively here. This is not always the denominating factor, but an artist will generally work on a self-commission, on something that's a personal project, on something that they want to do, whereas an illustration tends to be a little bit more commercial and has a client and a brief for commercial purposes behind it. So again, that's a huge generalization, but that's generally the gist. So I tend to work in Photoshop. We can talk about Photoshop versus Illustrator next week and the differences there. But I think there are heaps of illustrators who will use Illustrator. The main difference that I would say in between the two is that Photoshop is more of a drawing program, drawing and painting, whereas Illustrator is more of an image building program. And that might make a bit more sense again when we kind of go through that next week.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, that is a really good question, and a lot of people kind of get confused as to which one they should go for in their work. And the short story is you can just switch back and forth. All right, so we're going to start straight away painting in Photoshop here. And what I've got in my windows here, if you guys don't have this open, we can go to Window, and then we're going to find Brushes. And it's going to open up this whole panel for me. So I've got all my brushes here. I've got brush settings, and we'll take a look at that in a tick. And what I'm going to do is just use, for now, just a super basic round brush, just your really sort of traditional thing. And it's going to make a mark, and that's it. That's basically, you can really do any kind of drawing here as you kind of need to whilst you're working in this way with this brush. Very, very basic kind of brush, but if your drawing skills are confident enough, which mine this morning are not, apparently.
It's a warm-up exercise.
It is a warm-up exercise. Let's say that. Let's say that I haven't limbered up my drawing muscles yet. Which, all jokes aside, is actually a thing. You'll see a lot of illustrators kind of do these ellipses and kind of get the muscles and the blood flowing a little bit before they start sort of cracking onto a drawing. So this is, completely able to draw. I should also mention I'm using a drawing tablet. So the distinction between a drawing tablet and a mouse is my drawing tablet basically is a pen that I'm holding in my hand, and it allows me to draw directly onto a screen as if it was paper, whereas a mouse is a little bit more clunky. It's like holding a bar of soap in your hand and trying to draw with that. It's a little bit kind of weird and fidgety. But the main thing, what you'll see, and we'll kind of touch upon this in the settings, is that I will have a size difference depending on how hard I press down. So there's pressure sensitivity involved, just like there would be with a pencil or a brush, whereas the mouse is kind of on or off. There's no you're clicking harder or softer. It's just you are clicking or you are not clicking. So yeah, if you are thinking about doing sort of some intensive drawing in Photoshop or even in Illustrator, getting yourself something that's going to allow you to use a pencil or a pen-like tool rather than a mouse is going to be really, really crucial. And it's going to open up a whole range of different settings as well in Photoshop, which we'll look at in a sec. So yeah, basically that's the sort of the gist of painting. But at this stage, we've painted, as you can see in my layers panel here. So if you don't have that open, that's probably the one that never shuts on my workspace is layers. Layers are the molten core of Photoshop. Without layers, Photoshop completely falls apart. all gravity ceases to exist and everything flies off into space. So I always have this open, even in Illustrator. But as you can see in my layer panel here, I've got a background, which is just my piece of paper, and I've drawn straight onto that piece of paper. So for instance, if a client said, can I have this cherry blossom flower, and can you put some color behind it, or some color into it, I'm going to have to be really careful and paint, within the black lines that I've painted. And that's going to be a bit tricky, because if I go into here, just like with a real canvas, I'm going to have to, fix those things later on. So that's going to be a little bit of an annoyance here. And again, this is like super, super basic stuff, but I think, things that are quite important to cover. So this is not very like user-friendly at this stage, because I'm painting everything on the one layer, which kind of is basically what happens in the real world. But in the real world, for instance, if I was doing something like this, what I would do is I would first paint the color inside the petals, and then come around on top of it with a black outline, and then do my black line on top of that. So if you're painting on canvas, or if you're painting a mural, that's usually going to be the process that you're going to follow, rather than the other way around. So there are ways to kind of simplify that for you. That being said, if I now want to make this bigger or smaller or move it around, I can't, because I'm all locked onto this layer. So before we do any of this stuff, we're going to start drawing. I'm just going to make a new layer down here. So in my layer panel, I've got this little button down here. If you hover over things in Photoshop, it'll tell you what the button does. So this one creates a new layer. This also goes, by the way, for, we talked about keyboard shortcuts. So if you hover over the toolbar, which is over here, yours might look doubled up like this. I just like to kind of snap it to the side and just do it all in one column. If you hover over each tool, it'll tell you what that tool is, and you'll see in parentheses next to where it says brush tool, there's a B. That means on your keyboard, if you hit B, you'll switch to the brush tool. So these are all kind of really cool things to remember, because if you're using these over and over again, you really want to be able to kind of use them very quickly.
And so that's just a standard brush that you're showing at the moment, isn't it?
That's just, yeah, that's like, it couldn't get any more standard than this. There's literally no features, no bells and whistles on this. It's purely like, if I'm using a mouse, it's just a black solid line with no effects or anything. This is just basic as it gets. And we'll take a look at different things in a little second. But
yeah, so there was a question in chat just about how do I get that brush. So it is just a straight up circle round brush. So if you're looking at it and it's behaving a little bit differently to maybe when you open up Photoshop and select that brush, it's probably because Jeremy's using a stylus, like a Wacom pen, which adds the pressure, which has the tapered edges. So just letting you know, that might be why it's a bit behaving a little bit differently.
Yeah, so if yours, like I said, if yours is just a solid kind of black sausage line, where mine, you can see, is doing this kind of thick and thin, it's purely because this is the mouse and that is my Wacom stylus. So the mouse doesn't have pressure sensitivity, and we'll touch upon that in a second. But the two basic brushes that come baked into Photoshop are this soft edge brush and this hard edge brush, and like that's it. Like, this is as fundamental and basic as you can get a brush. It makes a mark. All right, so get rid of all that. So I've made a new layer.
From Anthony, how do you add tools to the top bar in Photoshop when you're trying to customize your workspace?
That is a great question, and one that I'm going to have to come back to you on.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Photoshop is contextual now. So a lot of the apps, I think someone in here was mentioning they use XD for web design. XD in particular is like an app that has a contextual menu. So whatever tool you're selecting, Photoshop will help you kind of give you shortcuts to the toolbars up the top. I know
Yes.
you could customize it. I'm not sure how much customization is still available, but the idea is that whatever, like, if you're on the brush tool, you'll get all the options for editing the brush. If you're on the select tool, on the magic wand tool,
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's essentially how Photoshop Creative Cloud works.
Yeah, exactly. So all the like the options that are up here will change contextually depending on what brush I'm in. How to add that bar in? I think if you go to Workspace Essentials, it'll just add it for you. I could be wrong,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm pretty sure that's pretty standard when you're in that kind of workspace. All right, cool. So I've created a new layer. You can see when I turn this on. So this is Photoshop's language to say there's nothing here. This is transparent. All right, when you see this kind of gray and white squares, that means we're seeing through. So if you can imagine, like, a layer is basically, if this is your piece of paper that you're kind of drawing on, a layer is like a piece of tracing paper, completely see-through tracing paper that will go on top of that you can make more stuff on. You can draw stuff on, and it will go on top of whatever you've created, but then you can move that piece of paper around, if you will. But that's essentially what's going to happen here is I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So on my screen, you'll see basically no difference at all. But from a file perspective, this is going to make all the difference in the world. First of all, I can move this around, and we'll talk about this in just a sec, but I can rotate, I can resize, I can do all kinds of different things. So this is now its own separate thing. So I can do whatever I want to it. I can turn it on or off, and I can pop a new layer underneath it that will then allow me to work with my colors and not have to worry, about painting with inside that black stroke, because that is now going behind on a separate layer behind my piece of paper. So layers are really at the core of everything Photoshop, and something that I work with like all the time and have to kind of talk about sort of layer control and all that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about next week. But this is the basic structure of Photoshop.
Which is
so
great,
now what I
because
can
all
do,
of us who are terrible at coloring in the lines, we just use Photoshop
like
to make us
this.
look like we're really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can also now come in with an eraser, right? So my eraser tool is the same thing. So as you might suspect, it is the keyboard shortcut for that is E on my keyboard. So E goes to my eraser, which is right here. And then I can erase any of these things without worrying about erasing this outline. So if I've screwed it up, I don't have to be too clean about it. And again, like, this sounds super, super basic, but it's the fundamental kind of workflow of Photoshop is let's keep all your options open. And this is an idea that we'll talk about probably next week as well, of destructive versus non-destructive workflows, which is something that you may or may not have heard about, but something that comes up quite a bit when you're talking about illustration and other kind of aspects of creative fields. This idea of like destroying versus not destroying pixels, because that is what Photoshop is. If we zoom in close enough, we will see
Pixel Town.
all the pixels. So Photoshop uses like all these little squares, all these pixels, and that's the kind of fundamental difference between it and Illustrator. But yeah, so now I've kind of made a super, super basic drawing on two different layers here. So it's probably going to be a good idea to start thinking about naming these layers, because you do have a bit of a preview in here, but when you start getting to like 50, 60 layers, relying on the preview might be a little bit tricky. Or if, for instance, I'll jump ahead and I'll go through what I've just done, for instance, with this. If I've duplicated that trying to find out which of these two layers is the correct one is going to be a little bit tricky. So naming them is going to be really crucial. So what you name them is kind of up to you, as long as it makes sense to you. I usually go with my outlines called OTL, and the fills are called fill.
Outline. So is that just your own shorthand? You could do anything. Yeah. It's just a shorter, quicker version that you recognize and you know exactly what that is. So you just talk to yourself.
Yeah, that's it. If I was handing over this file to another designer, I'd have to make it a little bit more clear than that, because your notes need to be read by someone else, basically. Whereas if it's just the notes are for you and no one else, you can write down whatever makes sense to you and what you're going to remember. So yeah, basically that's the kind of the gist of what we're doing with all of this. And I can come in with this layer and edit it a little bit later on, which is maybe going to be a little bit something we're going to save for, again, next week, and talking about like resizing, duplicating, editing layers and layer masks and all these kind of different ideas. But for now, what I really want to do is close this, and we're going to jump straight into importing an image that we've scanned. So this is a sketch that's been created in my sketchbook that I've scanned.
Cool. Samurai skateboarding.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, samurai, kind of techie, skateboardy dude. All the flavors that I like to.
Like paraphernalia on the top that would be on my high school backpack.
That's right. Yeah, a little bit of like cyberpunk kind of vibe. We'll talk about style in session 4 and kind of all those kind of deeper ideas, less sort of technical things. But just to kind of show you guys the principles here that are at work is, if you don't have a Wacom stylus, or if you don't necessarily feel super confident yet drawing in Photoshop because there's all these scary buttons everywhere and you want to do a pencil sketch first and then color it up in Photoshop, this is totally doable. So again, just a basic sketch. I haven't really done anything to this other than scan it. Important to scan if you can, if you do have a scanner, rather than photographing it on your iPhone or anything else, because you will just, the phone will give you different sort of shadows and things on the edges of the paper over here. You'll get all these kind of different things happen. So if you do have access to a scanner, that's always a really good way to do it. If you don't, there are ways around it. It's just going to take a little bit more work.
Yeah, cool.
So we've got this as a background layer. I'm going to switch now to a different view. So I'm going to cycle through these different views. So you've got this view where if I have a bunch of stuff open, so for instance, let's say that I'm going to open this one up. And by the way, how I'm opening these up on a Mac, this is similar on a PC, but it's got an extra step. On a Mac, you go to your folder, take that JPEG, and drag it down into your dock bar onto the Photoshop icon, and then let go, and it will just automatically open in Photoshop. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way and go to File, Open, and then go and find the file where it sits, and just select it there, and you can then open it from there.
We were talking a little bit about this yesterday with Ian Haig, and how click and drag is just so like appreciated now. Like it was such a novelty originally, and now because he was clicking and dragging a lot of things in Premiere, but just how it's so expected now. It's just the way it's done.
Yeah. And I think the extra step on a PC is that when you do that, it'll pop up a little menu from the dock, and you still then have to click on the file name, and then it will open it. So it's still pretty basic. I'm pretty sure that you can also do this. You can literally just drag and drop it straight into Photoshop from your actual folder, but then it will import it as a smart object. We're not going to get into that just yet. That's going to be a tale for another time. But there are a bunch of different ways. Usually the way that I will do it, as I said, is just drag it into the icon and then release, and then it will open up in Photoshop.
Cool.
So that's this image. Nothing's been done to it. There hasn't been any editing done to it. It's literally just a sketch as it stands. So what I can do now is I can create a new layer, and I can start painting on top of this with a very basic black brush. So it depends on what you're trying to do here. You could be inking this sketch. Okay, so literally using this sketch as a base. And this is where I think it's going to be important to make a distinction of what you're trying to do here. What's the idea? Are you just using this as a base sketch to then draw over in Photoshop? And then the sketch will be completely see-through, like you won't see the sketch at all. So for instance, something like this, I'm going to jump ahead and give you guys a bit of a preview of what this one became. Cool. So this is the kind of the final drawing that happened from that. There's been a few edits done to it, but you can see that the final sketch is nowhere to be seen. So the sketch, which is still here, and that's just kind of gone on top of it, has just been used as a base to create stuff, and then the image has been expanded and more stuff's been added to it because it's the digital world, so just go for your life. So either you're doing that, or you're doing the second option, which is the drawing will be apparent in the final product, and we'll talk about that in a little second. But important to think about what you're trying to do here, because it may mean that you need to actually do stuff to this drawing depending on what you're doing, right? So this drawing's a bit messy. There's a bit of kind of paper stuff everywhere that we can potentially clean up. We won't do it to this one because we're not going to use it for this one. And I will show you guys how to do that on the next one and edit it so that it's a little bit of a cleaner line work.
There was a question about why is the line work blue?
Oh, have I been muted?
No.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just something came up on my screen saying I was muted. Little kind of live tech things. Why is the line work blue? Yeah. The line work is blue. We get this question a lot actually, and it's something that I use quite a bit. The line work is blue because it's an old animator's trick where when they would shoot their animations on an actual camera in black and white, this blue would go to the same gray as the paper and basically fade away. So what you would do is you would come in on top with a nice sort of darker pencil and clean this up. So you probably heard the term sort of cleanup artist in animation before, where they were somebody who would come in on top of this very rough sketch and make a much cleaner line. And then when this would get shot, all the blue would disappear and you wouldn't have to worry about using another piece of paper or erasing all the blue. So that's where that comes from. It's stuck to this day because it's a nice way of making that distinction in between your actual drawing and the sketch behind it. So for instance, again, we'll look at this one in a little sec, but this one's got a bit of both. And so being able to kind of do very, very loose sketching with a blue pencil and then come and clean that up over on top with a darker pencil is incredibly handy. So blue pencil is just one of those things that started a certain way and now exists because it exists.
Right.
So yeah.
But you could sketch in grey if you preferred. Or
exactly. Yeah, we did one last week where I was sketching in blue and pink. It doesn't matter. It's whatever is gonna help you make that distinction. Traditionally, it's blue, but whatever color suits you best is what you should use. Right. So we're ready to go on this one. So we're going to basically start painting on top. So important to make a new layer always, because if I start drawing straight on this, again, once I'm ready to get rid of the sketch, which is the whole point of this one, is I'm going to get rid of the sketch. If I do this and get rid of it, it's not going to do anything. I'm going to get rid of the drawing behind it as well because everything is on the same line. So I need to put that on a new layer, and then I can start to go to town painting on this. And what I might do as well at this stage is put this image on top, because if I'm painting on top of it, it's going to start sort of hiding it as I go, and it's not necessarily going to be super conducive to what I'm trying to do. So basically, I'm going to take my background layer. I could make a selection, but I don't really need to. By default, and again, selections we'll talk about next week in a lot more detail, but by default, if nothing is selected, everything is selected. It's kind of like web design. If zero is the value, then it's everything. If you haven't specified what to do this to, I'm just going to do it to everything.
Right.
And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer from this. So I'm going to duplicate this background layer and put it on a new layer, because at the moment, by default, this is a JPEG. So this is locked. I can't do anything to it. You can see that all my menu's been grayed out at the top of my layer here. If I click on the eye, I can't turn it on and off. I can't really do very much to this at all. So I'm going to go into my layer panel, and you'll have to forgive me because I forget some of the keyboard shortcuts in here, because I forget where the menus are, because I always use the shortcuts. And quickly as well, if you go into your menu, you'll see that next to each function, there's a little command key. That's the keyboard shortcut for that. So it's worthwhile for you guys, if you're doing something over and over again, it's worthwhile trying to remember what that is. And I'm pretty sure that what I'm trying to do is this one, duplicate layer, background copy. Yes, okay, cool. So that's done that, all right? Now, that was a lot of steps. I've got to go up to my layer, hit one button, 2 buttons, 3 buttons, and then I've got my thing. That sounds like, come on, mate, are you serious? 3 buttons, that's not a big process.
Come on, mate.
But when you're in the midst of it, and when you're kind of drawing, those 3 buttons, like having to move your hand up to here and do the whole thing and all that, is really, like, it takes up time. All those little kind of like microseconds add up over your workflow, and they really start to cramp your style a little bit. So we're going to do the same thing, except a lot faster, and I'm going to do Command J, and that's basically done the same thing. So I've duplicated my layer. Command J, some of the keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop make sense, like B for brush, or E for eraser, or I for eyedropper tool. Some of them don't, like J for duplicate.
Right.
The way you remember, so some of them have already been taken up by other things that make more sense for them. J, I remember one of the guys that we used to work with, Laurie Goodridge, always used to make this joke, and it's a stupid joke, and for that reason it's stuck in my brain, and that's the whole point of it, is it's dumb so you'll remember it. J for duplicate, basically.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's awful, but now you'll always remember it. So Command or Control J, and that will make a new layer from my background drawing.
That's great. I really like that. But we just have a quick question, so I'll just jump in.
Yep.
Do you always sketch on real paper and then scan it into the computer, or only in specific cases?
Almost never.
Almost never. Pretty much.
Almost never sketch on paper anymore. Yeah, I'm usually sketching on digital these days, which is sad from a kind of an old kind of artistic, romantic point of view. But just the amount of possibilities that are open to you if you sketch digitally are huge. And yes, you lose that kind of romantic aspect of drawing on paper, and yes, there's also this thing of digital, you can just go like blah and just start painting straight away without kind of thinking about it. Whereas analog, pen and paper, you actually have to think about what you're doing before you do it, and that means that your drawings tend to be a bit more kind of realized, if you will. But
are you less experimental when you're on pen and paper because you're trying to be as close to perfect as possible?
Yeah, for sure. But less experimental,
a bit more freestyling
can be a good thing. I think having that restriction, I always compare it to digital photography versus analog photography. So digital, now you've got, like a memory card that can store like 5,000 photographs on it or more. And so you're just kind of shooting away, and then at the end of your holiday, you go into your folder and go like, okay, let me get basically rid of like 95% of this is all crap. And there's maybe 2 shots in there that worked well. Whereas in the days of analog, when you only had like 24 shots on your film and you actually had to get them developed and you couldn't see what they looked like at that specific moment you had to go into a shop and get them developed. You have to think about what the shot is and compose it, and like take a moment to really, pay attention to what you're doing. Whereas digital allows you to just like, let me just do this and I'll fix it later. Which is great for possibilities, maybe not so good for, a very sort of thorough workflow. So there are pros and cons definitely to both. But yeah, in answer to your question, I will use the digital sketching way more often than I will use analog, simply because it just saves time in the long run.
Yeah, cool. Great.
And it also saves trees as well.
Save the trees.
So I've popped this on a new layer because I want to actually paint behind it. So that layer is now here. I'm going to make a new layer sandwiched in between my background and my sketch layer. And I'm going to start painting. And you're not going to see anything happening because there's a layer on top of it. So what I need to do is I need to go into blending modes here. And we'll talk a lot about that next week when we talk about colors and all these ideas. Where it says normal, I want to move this down to, where is it, multiply, this one. And you can see that it's actually changed a little bit the color of my image, which is fine by me, because what multiply is doing is basically that image and that image are now multiplying together. So all the colors have doubled, everything is kind of gone more and more. If I do it again, you'll see that it just progressively gets darker. The more copies of that layer I make, the more yellow the page get and the darker the blue of that paper get.
Kind of looks pretty cool.
It looks all right, yeah, but it's not going to be super helpful for me to paint at this stage. So doing this one is going to be more than enough. Now, if I come in with my paint behind it, you can see that paint because it's showing through. And that'll come back in a second as well. So now, basically now's when I can have a bit more of a free-for-all and sort of pick maybe a light source, which I haven't really delineated in my drawing. So I can start painting away, and you can see that it's affecting the layer underneath, and it's not showing me my drawing. So it's going to be a little bit tricky for me to do all of this and see what I'm kind of trying to do, because the drawing behind it is disappearing as I'm going. So for instance, if I want to bring the teeth back, and I'm going to do that with my eraser, I'm kind of drawing blind because I don't know where stuff is, right? So what I actually need to do is to drop the opacity on my painting layer. So this currently is full black. Its opacity is set to 100. If I go to that layer, again, super important. A lot of people get super frustrated with Photoshop because it's like, why is it doing this thing? One of the things that my students really hate me saying, but it is nonetheless true, is Photoshop won't do anything you don't tell it to. And so if it's doing this thing, it's because either you're telling it to, or you're telling it, like you're not telling it not to, in a sense. And so for instance, if I'm gone on the wrong layer and I play with my opacity and I'm trying to diminish the opacity of my black, I'll be doing this and going like, what the hell? Why is it not doing what I tell it to? It's because you've selected the wrong layer. Right. So again, make sure at every step that you're quite sort of meticulous about what you're doing. This is basically like digital computers, all this kind of stuff. They won't do anything you won't tell them to. So you need to be really clear with your instructions. And then, they'll be a little bit more friendly to you, and you'll have a much easier time. So now I can actually see the drawing behind it, and I can play around with my eraser and my pen to get that kind of feeling, and I can really see what I'm doing a little bit more, so that when I turn on my layer again at the end, when I'm all kind of finished, all these things will show up again, and I'll be able to actually see my drawing a lot more clearly. So if I turn this off and boost the opacity back again, I can start to see what's been happening in my drawing. So this is me basically painting underneath that piece of paper which has my drawing on it, and then eventually I can just get rid of that drawing and I will end up with something like this. The only ingredient that's gone into something like this versus what I've just been showing you is time. This is just time spent on this drawing, trying to like get everything working the way it should, and adding a few things in there as well to kind of keep going, extending the image, all this kind of stuff. So that's basically just time has gone into this, and me trying to get it right, make it look a little bit more inking style.
Yeah, super cool. There was a question from Anthony in chat. Great question. In this particular instance, had you already decided what color scheme you were going to use?
Yes, I was really set on doing a black and white one, which is pretty rare for me. But every now and then, because of like manga references, so a lot of my work is kind of referencing manga and pop art and all that. So on this one, yes, I had decided I wanted this kind of like yellow, off-white page and black. This is also why I created this kind of halftone shading in here to kind of really reflect this kind of like manga ink drawing. And this is really what we refer to as digital inking when we're doing this, is really going to start to reflect, excuse me, reflect this idea of your inking now digitally in order to really kind of finish off that drawing. Cool. And so, yeah, that I was always going to do black and white on this one. But when I am working with color, yes, it is a good idea to plan those colors out, because again, digital can be both your best friend and your worst enemy, in that you can constantly change the colors again and again and again, and therefore, spend hours in the color changing hue saturation tool in Photoshop, and that's actually not making anything more. You're just adding changes, taking them out, and doing all these kind of different
weekends
things.
in the hue and saturation tool, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I love it, and I also hate it. And the only difference is if I love it or hate it is if I have a plan, if I don't have a plan. If I have a plan, I love it. If I don't have a plan, it's really going to start to like weigh me down and drag my workflow down quite a bit. So there's a good, there's a lot of power behind digital, but just like the Spider-Man thing, with great power comes great responsibility. And so you need to be responsible for your workflow when you're working with this, and make sure that you're able to still actually produce the artwork that you said you were going to do, and not just kind of spend days messing around in all these kind of different tools and options that are available to you, but will require you to have a little bit more discipline in order to not get lost.
Nice one. So we've got 3.5 minutes until Q&A. I've already got some pretty good questions. Well, I've got some great questions, but already got a handful of questions for us when we do get to that. So just letting you know, if you are watching, to get some questions, we're going to take, it's like a 5-10 minute little break in the middle where we'll answer all of your questions and focus on that. And just to mention, if you are just joining us, we're here with Jeremy Lord in the beginner's guide to illustration. So we're starting from scratch. So I know there's a lot of new followers or watchers since we first started. So we've been building basically from scratch, step by step, answering your questions, and kind of getting stuck in. So it's a great place to start. And we'll be here for a couple of episodes focusing on this and building up our knowledge together and building up our understanding of illustration and the foundations of illustration.
Yep. So again, like I said, the difference between this one and that one is just time, and spending on this, going back and forth. So what I'll do now is I'll show you the second case in point. So this again has been created so that we can just have this image on its own without the sketch behind it. But what if you actually want to draw on the thing itself? Like, what if you want to use the pencil sketch in your actual final piece? And then that goes to something like this. So this is a piece that's a very old piece for me. You can tell because it's not cyberpunk, it's not Japanese, and it's not 80s. So this is a much older piece. And you can see what's happened here is we still have a lot of those pencil qualities that are in here, but the paper has basically disappeared. So all of the grain of the paper, all the little things that happen, all the little imperfections, like this, for instance, have all disappeared. So this is a nice, super clean pencil work where we just, like, everything extra has basically vanished, and we can start to paint on this. And so what the important thing to remember here is, if your pencil drawing is going to be in it, you want to be able to approach this level of cleanliness as much as possible and not have to worry about other things that are going to come and like gum up the works and the colors a little bit. And so let me show you guys a bit of a halfway point. So a halfway point in between this and this is basically this one. So this has got some clean line and it's got some sketchy line. So how you guys are going to need to kind of clean this up? You can see here that you've got a little bit of the grain of the paper. We've got some things that have happened on another page behind it when I scanned it that are shown through. There's a whole range of different things here that are going to need to be a little bit cleaned up for me to be able to use this as a separate kind of drawing. So again, first thing is working non-destructively. Before I start messing around with this too much with the actual original, I want to make a copy of this. So Command J duplicates that, and then I can get rid of I can hide the one in the background. And then I'm going to add a layer in between these two for now, and then turn that off. That'll come back in a sec. All right, so I've got blue pencil and I've got this yellow kind of page. That's going to be a little bit tricky for me to fix because I've got this kind of color. So first things first is I need to render this image in black and white, so in grayscale. And that's going to be a lot easier for me to play with lights and darks when colors aren't involved in the mix. So there's two ways I can do this with Photoshop and Illustrator and After Effects and a whole bunch of range of different things, especially with Photoshop and Illustrator. There's usually more than one way to do the same thing. And whichever way works for you is definitely the way that you should work. It might not be the fastest way, it might not be the most efficient way, but if it's the way that works for you and that you know how to do and you're comfortable with, then that's what you should do. So you can either go to image mode and then go to grayscale, and that will do this for you.
And
but
so
you're going to have to
deal
deal
with
with
menus, just because you quickly instinctively click through them. Can you just explain what you're doing there, just in case?
Okay, so image.
Sometimes you blink and you miss it.
Yep. Image is basically everything to do with the image, so canvas size, all these kind of different things. And I'm going to go to mode. So mode is the color mode. So currently it's in RGB, which is red, green, and blue, which is good for screen. Again, we'll talk about all these different things a lot more in depth when we go through color next week. But what I'm looking for here is grayscale. But grayscale is going to be this. I wouldn't recommend doing this because what it's going to ask you is it will want to flatten your image, which at this stage is okay because I haven't created too many images, too many layers, so I won't have to redo too much work. So I could hit merge or I could hit don't merge, which I'm going to do.
Just to clarify that, what that means is all the layers on the right-hand side will squish into one single layer, which is a destructive way of working.
That's correct.
We usually try to avoid.
So if I hit merge, you'll see this one's telling me there's a little bit of a color information conversion that's going to happen. You can usually just go discard that or don't show again if you're not too worried. But see, now that's gone flattened down. So again, at this stage, not a big deal because I haven't really done very much work, and all I need to do is reduplicate and recreate a layer. But there's a much faster way to do exactly the same thing. Making sure that I'm on the right layer. I'm going to go to image, adjustments, and I'm going to go to hue saturation, which is this command shortcut. So Command U, right? So Command U, it's going to bring up this panel. I live in this panel. This is the panel that we were talking about before with Flynn, where it's just I'll spend hours and hours in this. Because what it'll do is it'll allow me to change colors on the fly, and like basically every time I do something, I'm like, hey, that's cool. I like that too, and I like this too, and I like this too, and it's like, come on, make a decision. So this can be super fun, but it can also be really a very slippery slope. What I need to do now is just drop the saturation down to -100, and that'll boost my image to grayscale. And you can actually see when I do that, already a lot of the little kind of bits and bobs that you can see in here that are in color will actually disappear. So I've got this now as a grayscale image. Again, if I messed up, I can always go back to my original. So I've always got that one there ready to go as a backup. But at this stage, I'm just going to use this one. So now I'm ready to kind of play around and clean this up a little bit. So I can clean this up manually, or I can try and clean it up from Photoshop. So let's try that first, right? So we're going to go back to our image menu, adjustments, and then we're going to basically just play with the brightness and the contrast, see if that works for us. So brightness is going to increase the image brightness. That's probably too much. That's too little. So I want to get the brightness up so that the white of the paper starts to shine a little bit more through, and get it as close to being white without losing too much of the drawing. So if I boost this all the way to the top, I lose the drawing too much. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So I can do to like 20, 25, and then I can up the contrast, and that will help me kind of get a little bit of a sharper line. But again, there's always going to be a little bit of give and take with this kind of stuff. So you've got to kind of think about how you balance those two things. Something that's going to be a little bit more in depth and allow you to play with more features, but it's going to be a little bit more complicated, is again, image adjustments, and we're going to play with the levels instead. So similar kind of thing, just with more knobs that we can kind of, and sliders that we can mess around with. So let's increase the whites, get the midtones and bring those down, and that's looking a lot kind of better already.
Great, yeah.
So the more these guys come into the middle, the more the thing that they're affecting will be boosted. So this one is telling you whites, this one is telling you midtones, that one is telling you darks. So you can see that kind of is going to work a lot better. If I was trying to do this with color, it would start to mess around with the values of each color, and that's not really kind of where I want to be with this. So levels is always going to be the kind of the go here with that. And you can see basically that my paper has basically vanished, aside from just a few little kind of bits and pieces that were a little bit darker. But I can really quite easily fix those things because I've got now a nice clean white background. I can literally just paint what's going on. Oh, I'm in the wrong tool. Again, before I get angry at Photoshop for doing the wrong thing, just remember what I've actually told it to do, and I was using the wrong tool. So yeah, this is just me literally painting with white and cleaning this image up a little bit. I can do that down here because I had some sketch ideas down there as well. So that's going to be important.
Can you explain why you're painting with white rather than using the eraser?
It really doesn't matter, to be honest. The eraser will visually do exactly the same thing. Okay. So if I paint with the eraser, you'll see this happen. So that's not great because I've got no layer underneath it. So the eraser will do bad things here, whereas the paintbrush will actually paint on top of it. So from a visual point of view, it's making a slight difference, but if basically this is the reason why I created this layer in between, is I can now come in with this one and fill this with white. All right. So filling is edit, fill, and I want to go with foreground or background color or white if I want to. So I'm going to just go with foreground and then go bang. Now I've got a white layer behind it. So if I come in with my eraser, you'll see that I don't see those black and white, those gray and white checkers anymore. So again, at this stage, because I'm just using white, it doesn't really matter if I paint or I erase, provided I'm just going to have a layer underneath it as well. That can be a little bit tricky depending on what we're doing later on. But at this stage, you can probably just use either the paintbrush or the eraser tool and clean this up in that way.
That's great. We are
But yeah, that's a good
a little
question.
bit overdue with our Q&A, by the way. So
Okay, cool.
Q&A
Well, let's
time.
jump into Q&A.
Cool. So yeah, so you can ask some questions while we're going along here. There's a couple that came up as we were going through that I thought would be good to ask. So do you use the Photoshop smoothing feature for your line work or any other plugins? Amanda was mentioning recently discovered Lazy Nezumi. Have you heard of that before?
Yes, I have.
And it's amazing, not just a smoothing tool, but also really helpful for rulers and guides. So that's a plugin to help. I understand to help create really smooth lines and some other things as well. Do you use anything like that, or can you explain kind of how your approach to smooth lines?
Yeah, absolutely. So the smooth tool in Photoshop is, I use it all the time on, so for instance, the sketch that I showed you guys before this one is obviously quite rough and not very smooth at all. A lot of the things that I will do, for instance, on stuff like this, or if I jump into something a little bit different, stuff like this, for instance, which we covered in a recent live stream, all this line work is a lot smoother. So I will use the smooth tool on this. And what it will do is it'll kind of prevent my line from getting that kind of like had too many coffees vibe.
Nice.
So up here in smoothing, if I boost that up, I usually have it around sort of 40, 50%. My line, if I drop it down, will go from like, again, if I'm drawing, you can see that it's a little bit kind of like a bit wavy. Mm-hmm. If I turn smoothing up to like 50, that gets diminished quite a bit. It just gives me a much kind of cleaner, smoother line. So Photoshop is great for that, and trying to get those really smooth lines can be really cool. What I don't use Lazy Nezumi. I use another one which is free. So Lazy Nezumi is a pay one. I use one called Hey Stylus, which looks like this. Where is it? This guy, Hey Stylus, which does exactly the same thing but is free, and has maybe fewer features. There is a paid option for it. What these smoothing tools do, one of the things that you can do, obviously I can use a smoothing tool in Photoshop when I'm using a brush, and it gives me these really kind of buttery smooth lines, which is really awesome. But as soon as I start drawing with a selection tool, for instance, something like this, I lose that. So I won't be able to kind of get that really kind of clean selection that I'm looking for in the same way. So that only works with brushes, erasers, and other things. So using one of those kind of tools allows you to have that kind of a smoother thing. And the way that it works, if you look at the Lazy Nezumi site, you'll see a demo of how this works. What you want to think about is like this. Your brush, say this is your brush, right? So exactly this kind of round brush. And then you've got your hand over here. So your hand usually is holding the brush. So whatever your hand does, your brush communicates exactly as is, which is why you get this kind of fidgety line, because now my brush is doing exactly what my hand is doing. What these third-party apps do is they pretend like there's a loose piece of string attached between your hand and your brush. So your brush is no longer in your hand. It's dragging behind you on this piece of string.
Right.
And so what it will do is it'll mean that like the longer that string is, the less translation you're going to get in the movement of your hand to that thing, right? So it's going to be very difficult for me to get this same kind of fidgety line. I'm really going to have to do it on purpose to get it, and even then it's going to be a little bit smoother. And what you'll also notice is this. If I draw, you'll see that the line will start appearing immediately, but you see how it's catching up to me a little bit? Every time I do it, it takes a second to go to where I'm actually at. And that's because of this line difference. So they're really awesome to use, but just be aware that when you're doing things like sketching, like if I turn this smoothing up to like 70 and I'm trying to sketch, like I'm drawing all the way to her hand. I can see my cursor, if you look quickly, I'm actually going all the way to the other side of her arm, but my line isn't actually going all the way to that. And so that can be a little bit annoying when I'm sketching, because it will just mean that like I'm not actually getting that smooth translation in there. So yeah, smoothing is more than enough for me in Photoshop. Whenever I need to, I will use Hey Stylist, but usually it's off and I just use the smoothing tool, and everything's fine.
Cool. We had another question. We touched on it briefly, but it does come up a lot, and there's been a lot of new people jump into the stream since the beginning. Just on your brushes, like, do you use the standard brushes, or do you have particular brushes that you might use?
Okay, so I will talk about brushes and brush customization after the Q&A in the second part of this, but cool. Okay. I have customized some of my own brushes, and then I do also use a lot of downloadable brushes as well that I've installed into this, because I'm not a brush making expert. There's a deep science to making a brush. And getting all the bells and whistles working. I'll show you guys today how to make sort of basic things and a few of the features, but some of the more sort of advanced ones, so for instance, from people like Carl T. Webster, and we'll talk about that after Q&A, is you're going to be absolutely need to download them. So you can see here in my panel, I've got some halftones, I've got some manga brushes, some pencil brushes, from a range of different things. And I've got some brushes that I've created myself. So I will tend to use some relatively basic brushes. I usually, because of the artwork that I do, I usually only use a pencil and an inking brush, which are these two. So Carl's Manga Smoothie and Carl's Dry Media Perfect Pencil. Those are the ones that I use the most, but I'll show you guys how to make some more kind of intricate case-specific brushes in a sec as well.
Cool. Awesome.
Cool. Yeah. So this basically now is my drawing kind of ready to go. I've cleaned it up as much as I can for this live stream. I've obviously spent a little bit more time if I needed to, working with this image a little bit more and cleaning it up a little bit more. But ideally now what I can do is I can pop this on multiply, and then I can paint with colors behind it. And that's going to allow me to really just keep that drawing in the final piece as is. And it's going to look really nice and clean, but also be able to be edited. So I can change the color of a range of different things in here. If I want her kimono to be a certain color, I can do that. As long as I'm kind of putting everything on separate layers, I'll be all good to go. And so now I'm just painting underneath my drawing, which means, again, later on, I can come in, Command U, bring this up, and I can change the color of that as I need and add or take away different things, adding more layers. So there's really kind of sky's the limit here in terms of what you can do with these kind of things, all the while just painting underneath your drawing. So using that kind of blending mode and trying to kind of figure out where things go is really handy moving forward, because it allows you to then have a fully rendered color image that you can work with without necessarily having to do some sort of heavy duty drawing in Photoshop if you're not super confident with that at this stage.
Yeah, something that I've noticed a lot from your process, watching it on Adobe Live and watching kind of how quickly is once you do get to color, is how quickly you can move and make changes. And quick kind of sounds like I'm just trying to get it done really fast. But what I've noticed a lot is that the faster you are with jumping around the menus, using shortcuts and things like that, is how more creative you can be. Like, would you agree with that? Like that being able to jump
Yeah.
around means that you can try lots of different things in the time that you have to create, and therefore try lots of different directions, see, you know, different color schemes, different color palettes, like very, very quickly. Whereas if you were clicking through the menus and clicking everything, it would take you a lot longer, and therefore you probably wouldn't try as many different directions. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's 100% the case. I think laying down the groundwork to then be able to kind of move quickly through the colors, so that then you can experiment a little bit more and really try and get you know, things that you wouldn't necessarily normally try are gonna be able to be done here. So I think definitely things like that are going to be really crucial to do this. But and again, like you said, it's not about, you know, rushing to the finish line. It's about getting to, like for me, for instance, and again, like the workflow idea, this idea that, like, you know, your workflow is an intensely personal thing, and nobody can tell you whether your workflow is the right one or not. If it works for you, then it's the right one, basically, is the short answer. But with my workflow, I know that I will spend a lot of time with color and making changes to the color ideas and the color schemes, unless I've got a specific plan, or unless I'm working on a client brief where they've said, you know, work with these specific colors only. That's going to always be super important for me to look out for. And so I will do a lot of groundwork to then be able to mess around with the color. And this is the important thing as well. If you're doing something like this by hand, and then you're gonna paint over it in Photoshop, it's important to think ahead about what you're gonna do, because, for instance, if I had drawn this on a sketchbook that had slightly thinner paper, and there was an ink drawing behind it that had bled through to, you know, all the way around here, there's this kind of all this stuff, that's going to be a lot more work for me to clean up later on. And so you need to really kind of plan ahead when you're doing these things of, like, what's going to be the easiest thing for me to work with in Photoshop, so that I can minimize the amount of cleanup work that I have to do and get straight into the actual painting of this image. So, you know, again, things like the cleanliness of this line and how sketchy it is versus how kind of clean it might be, things like that need to be addressed early on when you're doing analog, and things that you need to think about. So I will spend a fair amount of time making sure that things are ready for color. And so all of a sudden my image goes from, like, looking like it's 20% done to 80% done. But that's because it's kind of like your prep in cooking. Like, you've already chopped all the onions and done all the, like, heavy lifting with that. Now all you need to do is throw it all into a pot and turn on the oven. And it's like, whoa, okay, that was quick. But because you've laid down the groundwork beforehand, that's why you can do this kind of stuff and not have to mess around too much.
You just reminded me of those cooking shows, how they've already got everything, like, diced out and portioned perfectly, and it's super clean. They go, hey, this is only going to take you 20 minutes. And it's like, because you skipped the hour and a half of all your assistants, like, chopping everything up perfectly.
Yeah, totally. I always think about that in the Jamie Oliver's 15-minute meals.
Right.
It's like, yeah, but, like, you've got 2 ovens and you've done all this kind of stuff. Also, like, he's always just got, like, olive oil all over his hands and he's grabbing jars. It's like, yeah, who's going to clean that up?
Yeah, someone's cleaning that up. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's going to take you 15 minutes to clean the kitchen. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I love the food analogies, as always. It always really brings it home for me.
They always apply. So basically, again, the difference in between something like this and a finished piece is just going to be time at this stage, and me spending time to get all of the elements all colored up, looking clean, drawing inside the lines, and making sure that everything's looking the way that I need to, and then adding color if I need to, maybe throwing in a background color behind it to kind of mix it up a little bit. Yeah.
And
There we
just
go.
letting you know as well, chat, just because we've passed the Q&A halfway point does not mean that you can't ask questions. So maybe you're watching on YouTube as well. We're over at behance.net/live. And if you jump into the chat there, feel free to ask your questions. It's a great time to do it. Jeremy's here to answer your questions. We're here for about another 40 minutes or so. So don't hesitate, jump in. There's no silly questions.
No, absolutely. I think it's always, usually it's that thing. I see this with my students a lot, where it's like, I don't want to ask the question because I don't want to look like a dummy, but then you do, and everybody else is like, "Ooh, I'm glad you asked that question."
Glad someone asked that question. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, like I think as well, like the important thing to remember is nobody is expecting you to know Photoshop inside out. So for instance, if I was to look at somebody like Demis, who does a lot of photography in Photoshop, he would probably know about features and menus that I don't even know exist. And conversely, like all the things that I need to do for illustration, he doesn't really touch upon. So it's, Photoshop or Illustrator, any of the Adobe programs, for what you need to do in them. And programs that are as extensive and sort of flexible as Photoshop, nobody's expecting that you will know where every menu is and what they all do. You'll know what you know, and you know what you use the most often, and that's fine. That's all you really need to know when you're doing this stuff, because realistically, it's not viable for anybody to remember every possible permutation and option available in Photoshop. You would just that would be completely insane. So just remember what you need to do, and the keyboard shortcuts apply to those things that you do very often. Like for me, for instance, a really nifty keyboard shortcut that I use all the time when I'm trying to fill something. So for instance, if I want to fill this background layer with something, I can, if I want to, so let's go and pick like a blue. I can go to edit, fill, and again, that's like 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons to do the whole thing. Or I can pick my color from here and then do Option Delete, and that will fill with foreground, or Command Delete will fill with the background color. So those are the two things that I use all the time when I'm doing this, and they'll come again, as you guys will see in the next few sessions, they'll come back again and again and again. But yeah, I use that a lot. I use my brush a lot. I use Command J a lot. There's a whole bunch of different things that I've kind of discovered over the ages that I'm like, okay, yeah, that's handy. I'll use that a lot. Commit that to memory.
Yeah.
And a lot of other stuff that's just like, you know what? I don't know how to do that. I only need to do it once. Let me look up how to do it on YouTube, and then I'll forget how to do it. And next time I need to do it again, I'll have to learn how to do it again. That's fine. That's okay. That's a realistic approach.
Exactly.
It's like a language, right? Like you need to practice that language in order to know it. And when you go to a foreign country, you learn how to say things like, "Could I have, please?" or "Sorry, I don't speak the language," or "Do you speak English?" or whatever. Those are the things you learn because those are the things that you are going to need to say. You're not going to need to learn what time is the Skype meeting for the planning of the marketing session. It's you're not going to have to learn that stuff.
Right.
So don't worry too much about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important distinction to make. Is I do think people, and this is a beginner series, so it's probably important, just to drill down on that. Is that a lot of people get hung up on learning everything there is to possibly know about an app, and if you don't, then you're not an expert, or you don't have 10 stars out of 10 for it. And yeah, it's absolutely not what you need to do. And Photoshop has been around for 30 plus years. There is a lot under the hood. There is a lot going on.
Yes,
in this
there
app.
is.
It caters for a wide range of different use cases, like so many, and probably lots that are not as commonly known as well. So yeah, it's a tool to be used how you will. It's a little bit like a workshop. If you imagine a workshop with lots of tools on the wall and everything, it doesn't mean you have to be building a specific thing. You just use the workshop to build what you would choose.
Yeah, and exactly. And, sometimes, and this is the thing that's really awesome sometimes, is when, Adobe will release a feature and they say, we think it's for this. And then the community will take it and it's like, actually, you know what? It really works for this.
Mm.
And like your tool shed analogy, like a hammer has a specific use, but you know what? I'm just going to use mine as a paperweight. Like it works perfectly fine for that too. So I think, all these kind of different features that theoretically should be used in a certain way, if you find a different use or if you find a hack for them, then that's great. People love that kind of stuff where it's like, I use a stapler to like cut my meat. It's like, what? How do you do that? Let me show you how that works. Probably don't do that, but
you could.
Yeah, you could if you really tried.
There was a great question. Do you use color lookup adjustment layer when you finish your designs?
I do, yeah. I use a lot of that. And we'll talk about that next week. But just quickly, what an adjustment layer will do is, if I go down in here, again, we'll cover this next week in a lot more detail, but that will give me a really quick way of adjusting the colors and kind of seeing like, hey, that looks cool. I kind of like the like hot green, fluoro green jacket, or I like her skin to be like a kind of a green color instead, and the jacket can be blue. It's more traditional. All those kind of things we can look at. So we will look at that in a lot more detail next week, with kind of selections and masks and all that kind of stuff.
There was a follow-up question just before to your color. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Or do you want me to ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
how do you find the right balance with colors in your artwork? What things do you do to make sure they work consistently together?
So I usually like to work with very kind of vivid neon colors, as is probably apparent if you look at my website. Usually what I like to do is I like to have a very complementary color scheme. So what we'll see is things that are like, a lot of purples and pinks and kind of similar colors on the side of the color wheel, and then one color that will be really kind of the pop color that will be a complementary one. And that's the kind of the color scheme that I really like to kind of treat and work with, is all these kind of ideas of overall kind of similar tones living on the same side of your color wheel. So if you look at a color wheel, you'll see these, like, when we refer to the same side, like this is one side of the color wheel. So yellow all the way to purple, those are all the warm colors, all the cool colors. And so what I'll do is I'll try and work with like purples and reds and oranges, and then throw in a blue to really kind of mix that up, just to give it a little bit more contrast and boost the kind of the clarity. But otherwise, yeah, the colors that I will use vary, and I like to use kind of different color schemes. And that's something that I spend a lot of time kind of developing what goes with what. A dark shadow or a warm shadow, depending on, like, blue will give us a dark shadow, red or like purple will give us a slightly warmer shadow. All these kind of ideas really kind of have to mix around. So for instance here, if I'm kind of looking at this, the colors aren't working super well because the blue and the green of the skateboard are very close together. And so this image becomes a little bit hard to read from a distance as to what's the face and what's the skateboard and what's this green thing coming out. So there's probably going to be a lot of editing that I'm going to need to do to this. And so, for instance, this is why I spend a lot of time in here, because I will do what you see is what you get. Like I'll know it when I see it, kind of thing. And I'll just edit and keep editing until I get to a spot where I'm like, cool, that's a good amount of contrast. And then I'll let that go and then move on to the next one. So for instance, in here, maybe that needs to be a little bit darker to distinguish from the skin, or maybe it needs to be a slightly different color. If there's too much pink, then it'll blend into the background. So I usually have an idea of the colors that I want to use beforehand. And then about halfway through the artwork, all that kind of goes out the window, and I just improvise and use the hue saturation sliders to just kind of eyeball it. So that doesn't really answer your question.
No, it does. No, it's great. Like,
it's a
great,
bit
like,
of kind of experimentation.
Yeah, it's great to talk around color, because I think it is like it's a subjective thing. It's also something that can be quite difficult to get right. consistency is really difficult to get right, I think, for a lot of people, especially when you look at things like a curated feed on something like Instagram or your website. Also, for people starting out trying to develop a style, color is so important. So, I mean, I think we're probably going to dedicate quite a lot of time to it, you know, in this series at some point.
Yep.
So it's great to talk around. We could possibly talk about it all day.
We could totally. The most important thing to remember is you need to do images that read relatively easily, that you can see what's what and that stand out. So, like I said, if this background color is too close to the jacket, then from a distance, this image becomes tricky to read.
Right.
I can't see kind of the differences in between what's happening. And so that's the thing that's the kind of the thread that I will kind of keep the most kind of relevant throughout is, how does this image read? What's the shape? Can I distinguish in between the two things? If the skin and this thing on her back are too similar, then it looks like she's got some weird skin flap coming off on the top of the skateboard, so that doesn't work. So I need to think about all this kind of thing. So yeah, that's the main kind of thing that I will look at for using color. But there is a plan, and then the plan is abandoned.
I like it. I like it a lot.
Okay, cool. I think we've got about half an hour left, so just enough time for me to kind of talk very quickly about the Liquify tool, and then we'll jump into how to create and download brushes, and that'll probably take us to the end. Cool. So again, pencil drawing, flat. So when we talk about flat, it means that this is just a JPEG, that there's no separation between the background and the pencil. So if I erase the background, I will also erase the pencil. So this is now a flat layer, but when I've done a pencil drawing like this, one of the things that you can do, and this is more to do with proportions and so on than anything else, but one of the things that I'll look at is the proportions of all this, and do they work? What's kind of wrong with this, and how can I fix it? So there are certain things that I can fix in Photoshop. But again, this is a kind of like, this is a seasoning. This isn't like baked in. So if you're going to do kind of, I guess, a bad drawing, thinking that you're going to be able to fix it in Photoshop, it's potentially possible, but the amount of legwork and lifting that Photoshop is going to have to do might make that quite prohibitive. So it's a good idea to try and get things right when you're doing the pencil drawing anyways, and then only do minor fixes when we're looking at Photoshop, because there are limitations to working with a flat JPEG in Photoshop. It seriously cuts back on the amount of things that it can do for you, whereas if we're working on a layer, that's got a little bit more flexibility. But a quick little hack to check proportions is to change your kind of point of view on the image, and one of the ways to do that is to flip the canvas left and right. So doing this immediately gives you kind of a different look on this. So I can see that her shoulder's a little bit big, maybe her leg's a bit short. There's something wrong with the breast here that needs to change. But I've already drawn this. So, you know, the amount of effort involved into going back in and redoing the whole drawing, because it's an analog thing, you can't just erase one bit and restart the whole thing, is going to be quite tricky. So one of the things that I can do here is, again, I'm going to duplicate this. So I've got a copy of it, so it's not destructive. And I'm going to go to Filter, Liquify. And that's going to change my image to goo, basically, and allow me to move things around as if my image was kind of a little bit gooey. So there's a whole bunch of different options here. Most of these we won't really need too often. The main one will be Warp Tool. So this forward Warp Tool will allow you to push like elements around and like do this kind of stuff. So obviously that's completely out of whack. But for instance, this shoulder is a little bit big. So I can just readjust the proportions of that, drag that back in, maybe move that out. She is a kind of a big sort of burly Viking warrior, so she is a bit muscly, but maybe not as muscly as that. This leg is a bit short, so I can try and do a little bit of a quick rough hack here. You'll see that it's going to take some of the drape behind her as well. So there, again, this is where it's like there's a little bit of give and take with Photoshop. It's this is one of those things where maybe you should have just done the drawing right rather than rely on Photoshop to fix it for you.
Right.
But little things like this can be really helpful to do in Photoshop later on, and try and get those proportions looking a little bit better, and things to be just the way you need them to be, without necessarily kind of having to redo the whole drawing. So I'm pretty happy with that, and so I'm just going to hit return. And so I've done one before where you can see this is the one where it's fixed, and this is the one where it's not. So just little minor things like this that really kind of help you in Photoshop. And then we can put this on a multiply layer and then kind of draw underneath it, and all the shading and pencil and everything that we've got will apply. So we just need flat colors because all the shading's already been done. So things like this can be really awesome to work with, if that makes sense.
There was mentioned in chat, does your sketch lose its sharpness when you use warp?
Yes, so some of the pixels will get a little bit blurry. As long as you don't do it too much, you should be fine. But if we look at something like this, for instance, there's a fair bit of sharpness, or something like this. So there's the difference between this area up here and that area down there is a blur. So again, like let's push this to ridiculous measures. But if I go in on something like this, for instance, and really start to pull this out, you'll see that it starts to blur a little bit. And that's really not cool, because what it's doing is it can't create more sketch. Photoshop isn't that good that it can just make image for you. So it has to work with what you've already created. So this will definitely lose that kind of sharpness of the sketch. So again, this is where it's like, if you do this and rely on Photoshop to do too many things, it won't do what you want it to. So definitely avoid, if you can, sort of plan ahead and avoid having to, let Photoshop just do everything for you, because it can't. At the end of the day, it still needs an artist behind it who knows what they're doing and who's relatively confident with their skills. And then Photoshop can come in and help you out. It's really just a high-tech pencil is what you want to kind of view Photoshop as. A really, really, really high-tech pencil with a lot of buttons and a lot of different options. But at the end of the day, there isn't a tool in here that will take your image from being terrible to making it really awesome. If your drawing is not great, if the foundation of it isn't solid, then you're just going to be there's this expression in design called polishing a turd, which it kind of applies here a little bit.
Right. I guess that leads me to a question of where, if there's people watching this and they do want to kind of learn those fundamentals that you're kind of speaking about, because you spend a lot of time learning your craft, what advice would you give to people that, we're all at home and practicing isolation and things like that? What would you recommend to someone that they say, great, I want to learn, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I learn these fundamentals?
So again, like the most fundamental drawing thing that you can do is figure drawing. So figure drawing is a model comes in, takes their clothes off, and you draw them. The reason why that's fundamental is because the human body is probably one of the hardest things to draw, where there's so many proportions and things to think about. If you can master that, it's kind of like the New York of drawing. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So if you know how to do that properly, then you're off to a really good start. It can be incredibly frustrating at first, because like most things, if you feel like you're not good at it, you're not going to enjoy it when you start. But it is, I think, one of the nice things about drawing. It's also one of the frustrating things about drawings, but I think it's one of these things that's just like, it's kind of nice that in this digital day and age, there are still things that you can't do digitally, that you just have to do the old school way. And drawing is definitely one of those. There's no shortcuts to drawing. You just have to spend time on it. Time is an ingredient of drawing. It's a little bit like a slow roast. You can't put that stuff in the microwave. because if you do, like, you're going to be missing one of the major ingredients, which is time.
Time.
And so
like
there's no shortcuts here in that. Is like a slow roast. One of the ingredients is just hours. And trying to pop that in the microwave will just not do the same thing. And so I think with drawing, that still very much applies nowadays, where it's like, yes, Photoshop will substantially speed that up for you. And the difference is a little bit like if you have a high-tech oven versus just a campfire. Like you know, Photoshop is the oven that will allow you to regulate the temperature and set a timer and tell you, you know, grill it from the bottom or from the sides or whatever the hell. All these different options that an oven can do for you is basically what Photoshop can do, versus a campfire, which is just like, it's fire, it'll do this heat all the time in this spot, and that's it, and you need to turn the thing. That becomes a little bit trickier. So yeah, but at the end of the day, it's still just doing the same thing. It's still just applying heat. And if you don't know how to do that, then it's still not going to be amazing, if that makes sense.
Mate, I love having you on the live stream, but you always make me so hungry. I really want a slow roast.
It is winter here, so it is appropriate, isn't it? Other than that, I think just online, looking at I save a lot of stuff on Pinterest for tutorials that just shows me how to draw faces or eyes or all those kind of things. You never stop learning. You're always like challenging and learning new stuff, especially hands and faces are the kryptonite of a lot of artists. And so just, copying and looking at other people's art and drawing it and trying to reproduce it is a really valuable drawing thing to do. But at the end of the day, the end story is just practice, and then practice some more, and then keep doing it. Especially when you're starting out, you just need to be drawing all the time, because it's not like riding a bicycle where you can just learn it and then, you know, pick it up again a few years later and you know how to do it. It's exactly like a language. If you don't practice it, you will forget it and you will get worse at it. So you just need to keep doing it again and again and again, and just keep learning. Like I'm still looking at how to draw faces. I still every now and then go to life drawing classes and figure drawing classes to learn how to do all these things. So yeah.
Fantastic. Still hungry.
Yeah, still hungry. Okay, let's jump into making our own brushes and creating brushes. I think we've got about 20 minutes left.
Yep, 18 to be precise.
Yeah, so should be enough to kind of cover what we need to cover. Cool. All right. So brushes are the be-all, end-all of illustrating in Photoshop. And so when you open up your...
Sorry, there's just been 2 mentions recently about saving your file. Yes, very important to save your
Yes, file. Yeah. Photoshop has a recovery system now where if your computer crashes, it'll save it, and it's usually pretty good. But yeah, definitely a good idea when you're working on stuff to save that file as you go. And put it somewhere you can remember. I haven't done that because these are just exercises, but yeah, usually that reflex is there. I do have students come to me a lot and go like, hey, my computer crashed and I didn't save my work. What can I do? Like, nothing. There's nothing you can do. You don't have your work anymore.
You just learned the most valuable lesson about becoming a designer.
Exactly. And we all have to learn this the hard way eventually one day when you worked for hours and then you lose everything.
Your next lesson
but then you'll always remember it.
Is storage. The first lesson is saving, and the second lesson, the hard lesson that you learn is, not saving your work, or having files corrupt, or saving everything on a hard drive and losing it, or having it become corrupt. That's the next hard lesson.
Yep, for sure. And it is one of those things. It's just like, don't stub your toe. I stubbed my toe. Now I know not to stub my toe.
Right.
Okay, so brushes. So in your brushes can be a little bit funny when you look at them as to why is this round brush doing this sharp line, or what's it actually doing? So we actually need to kind of dissect this brush and look into it a little bit. So there's a whole bunch of settings here. Again, you probably don't need to know all of them. This is where the people like Carl T. Webster and all that, they would know what all of these do. I know a bunch of these, and the rest of them I have no idea what they do, nor do I really need to. because I'm not a brush creator. I'm a brush user, and usually somebody who uses relatively simple, straightforward brushes. But that being said, there's two menus that we're looking at here. First of all is this brushes menu, which is where all your installed brushes will go with all its settings predisposed. And then there's the brush settings here, which is this panel where all your brush shapes are, and then this one, which is all the settings of the brush. All right. The most basic setting is going to be spacing. So spacing, if I boost my spacing, this is where you'll start to see, okay, I get it now, it makes sense. We've got a round brush, and because each one of these nozzles is applied separately, it does this, which can be really cool. Like if you're into like Aboriginal dot art or something like this could be really awesome. But what you need to understand, and this is critical because it means that it changes the way you understand how a brush works. A brush isn't one continuous line. It's a lot of these shapes. And if you decrease the spacing, it gives the illusion of one continuous line. But what has actually happened here is a whole bunch of different dots put together really closely to give the illusion of a line. And why that's important is when you download something like this, for instance, or this isn't one of the ones that comes baked into Photoshop, if you just click once, you'll see that. But if I do a line with this, you'll see this kind of stuff. So it's just this image applied a whole bunch of different times in a row. Make sense? And so again, I'll show you guys something really kind of stupid and kind of interesting to understand how a brush actually works and how you can actually make a brush from something, because you can basically make a brush from anything. And for some reason, I always use a photo of Obama when I'm doing this, but I'm not going to do this on this one. I'm just going to use this. So this is one of my pieces. And I'm literally going to take this and go Edit and define brush preset. Done. And we're going to call it whatever. I'm just going to call it XX because I'm going to delete this later on. And you'll notice that it's gone to black and white. And so now you'll see in my brush settings, you can kind of see an outline of that image. It's kind of this weird thing that's happened. So if I just click once, it gives me a grayscale version of that image. Cool. So now if I look at that, if I paint with this will happen. I'm not actually getting my image. I'm just getting a black kind of fat chisel line kind of thing. So what's happening is it's just applying that image like in a quick succession with less spacing in between them. That's how a brush works. It takes an image and then it applies it a bunch of times over the course of a stroke. So if you kind of create a brush like this, a lot of brushes that you'll find online are absolute garbage because they'll sell you like a smoke brush, and all it is a photograph of smoke. And then you go and try and paint smoke with it, and it's like, what the hell? That doesn't look like smoke at all. Right. So not all brushes are created equal. And you need to really understand how a brush functions in order to be able to kind of work with it properly. But let's go in and create, let's go in quickly and make this brush. So this is a brush nozzle that's baked into Photoshop. Okay. So you could have drawn this, for instance, made this little leaf, and then gone to, again, Edit with that thing selected, and then define brush preset, and it'll make that leaf into a brush for you. All right. But again, if I draw with this, it's like, oh, that's weird. So what I need to do here is I need to give it a bit more spacing. So we're going to draw kind of like a tree kind of brush where it's going to allow us to draw branches, like a leaf foliage in a tree very kind of quickly and roughly and easily to get an idea of something, which is something that a lot of concept artists will use. Right. But I've spaced it out so that I can now see each individual leaf on its own rather than this like strange leaf smudge. Yeah. So that's first step, boost the spacing up. Then we're going to go into the settings down here and go to our shape dynamics. So we've got different things, but they're all the same size. That's not very natural. So we're going to play with the size jitter. And you'll see down here in my preview, it'll give me a little bit of a preview of what that's going to do. So now what it's going to do is it's going to apply a different size leaf every time it applies that particular shape. So that's looking a little bit more natural. I've got some big ones and some small ones. Can play with how much that actually varies. So that's all good. Then I also want them to not all be the same angle. So I'm going to play with the angle jitter, and you can see that some of them will start to rotate a little bit. So that's going to be, again, a little bit more interesting, and that's going to start to give me a little bit more of that kind of foliage tree vibe.
Cool.
So that's all looking cool, but again, I want actually I can mess around with colors here as well. So if I mess around with this, I've got a kind of an autumn color, and then I want to make some like red-orange ones in here. So I can kind of do this, right? But I don't necessarily want to have to switch between my foreground and background color all the time as I'm doing this. I want Photoshop to do that for me. If I did, shortcut for that, if you look down here, X switches between foreground and background. So I can paint some orange, quickly paint some red, paint some orange back in, and try and get that kind of vibe in there. But that's only kind of 2 colors. It's not necessarily the best thing ever. So I'm actually going to go to my color dynamics and say, I want you to mess around with the foreground and background jitter as we go. So this is now doing it as a bit of a background. So I want to untick apply per tip. I want to tick apply per tip. And there we go. So 100% apply per tip. And what it's doing is it's going a gradient in between the red and this orange. So let me switch this orange to like a slightly more different color, like this bright yellow. And now it's getting that kind of vibe. So every application of that leaf has got a different size, a different angle, and a different color ranging in between this yellow and this red. And that's going to be really awesome for me to kind of mess around and get something looking really cool. So you can do this with a whole range of different things. But those are your kind of basic brush settings to allow you to do all this kind of stuff.
That's super cool. I didn't know about the color spectrum that you can kind of jump between with your foreground and background. It's going to come in really handy for my Christmas cards this year.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, again, like all these different kind of brushes that you can mess around with. For instance, I've created this brush that has a stitching effect for like sewing. So all it is this little kind of tic-tac, and it just does this, right? But one of the things that we can do here is like, I don't want it to, I want it to always be in the angle of what I'm trying to do, right? So as I'm doing this, they're always vertical. I don't want that. I want them to change angle. So again, I'm going to go into my shape dynamics. I'm going to get angle jitter. I'm going to leave that at 0. And this is where we're going to see the difference between a Wacom and a Cintiq as well with this control. So what controls the jitter in the sides? Either it's by default. So you can do this slider and it'll just do it automatically. Whether you're using a mouse or a Wacom, it'll mess around with the sides randomly, or I can set this to pen pressure. On this one, I want to set the angle jitter to direction. So this is now going to keep it in the direction that I'm going, and it's going to rotate that stitching according to my stroke. So if I've got, again, if I'm trying to do this kind of like sewing effect, that will be really handy because it'll just kind of go with the seam the whole way through.
Right.
Really awesome as well for doing things like, let's create a really quick chain brush, for instance. So I'm going to draw on a new layer. Let's get rid of this. On this new layer, I'm going to draw 2 chain links. Very, very basic. Like this. Okay, I'm doing this super, super rough because we're running out of time very quickly. Edit, define brush preset, call it whatever you want, chain, done. They're all vertical, So I'm going to need to change that. Okay, so I'm going to need to change the angle spacing so that they're all separate. Change the actual hard angle of it to be horizontal, like so, so 90 degrees. And then go into my shape dynamics, angle, jitter, direction. Go back in here, space it out, and then you can see how my chain link is going to work. And so this is going to allow me to basically paint a chain super fast.
That's cool.
And again, this is where Photoshop, like doing this by hand would just take you like days and days and days. In Photoshop, you can just do this super quick. And if this, again, granted, you know how to kind of use these brushes and how they all work. So it's this application of this one image a bunch of times in a specific angle allows you to kind of do all these kind of things. And then finally, if you're not super keen on creating your own brushes, and these are all kind of very specific, if you have to draw chains, then you can do this like this. But what if you have to draw anything else? This brush doesn't really work that way. So we're going to download and load some brushes. So in your brushes panel here, so we've got brushes, settings, and brushes. You've got the ones that come pre-baked into Photoshop, but you can download some other ones as well. And I think it was about like a year or two ago, Adobe partnered up with Carl T. Webster, who was a very famous artist who was making a lot of brushes and selling them online. And now as part of your Creative Cloud subscription, you have free access to all of his brushes, which is just absolutely awesome to have, because it's huge resources of really good brushes from somebody who knows exactly what they're doing with all these settings. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into our panel here and say, get more brushes. And that's going to open up Carl T. Webster's and Adobe's page where you will see all the brushes that are available. So he's got a mega pack, which is all his brushes. He's got watercolor, dry media, gouache, splatter, runny inkers, all this kind of stuff. So you can download it. I'm not going to download because I've already pre-downloaded one called Manga Brushes, which is this. And it downloads this ABR file, which is, I think it's Adobe Brush, I think. Makes sense. And then all you need to do is double click it and it'll install automatically. And it will show up in your panel here under a nice clean folder called Dry Media. So that's the ABR brush that I installed. And you'll see all these different brushes in here. And all of them come with different settings and different applications. And they're just absolutely awesome to use depending on. So you got some really kind of cool ones in here. You got Conte Pencil. Lots of really, really, really awesome brushes that have a lot of applications depending on what you're trying to do. Yeah, so some kind of chalky ones. Again, these are all dry media ones. He's also got some half tones and screen tones. So things like these kind of patterns that can work really well depending on what you're trying to do. Some of them are very, very specific to things, like this tile pattern is quite specific, but half tones, for instance, if you're doing manga, is going to be really, really awesome to use. So yeah, so don't hesitate to really kind of go in and get those, because they're free, they're there, and they're built by people who know what the hell they're doing. And so the ones that I use all the time are this pencil brush. So again, this is a Carl T. Webster brush, and it's pencil. And just quickly, instead of using black with this to get that more kind of pencil-y effect, I usually actually use a kind of a warmish browny red like this, which is a lot more akin to what pencil lead looks like. It's not quite black. It's just a lot easier to kind of handle. And this brush comes with these particular settings. So again, in my settings here, you can see if I go in, I've got pen pressure. And this is the difference. If you don't have a Wacom, you won't be able to do this. And so you'll see this little like exclamation point that's usually tells you this requires the use of a pressure sensitive tool. So this is it with my mouse. It's just black. This is it with my Wacom. It's light. If I press down harder, it goes black. So it's small and light if I'm pressing softly. It's big and a lot darker if I'm pressing harder. And so this is, again, a lot more akin to using an actual pencil
Yeah.
and trying to get that shading where you can really sort of press a bit harder and get that soft gradient, make a nice smooth shadow. That's why like a Wacom like this is going to be absolutely crucial.
Hey, you know what? We are out of time, my friend.
Cool. Well, I think that's everything. So just in the nick of time.
Just in the nick of time. Got about 30 seconds for the hard cutoff. It's been great hanging out with you this morning. Just to and everybody in chat, thanks for the great questions. It's been super awesome. Sorry we have to cut it out fairly quick. Behance can be a harsh mistress and will kick us off as there's no negotiating. Thank you so much, Jeremy. We're going to be back at the same time, so I'm going to leave you guys with the schedule so you can see when we'll be back. But we're going to be back for a couple of weeks with step 2 in Beginner's Guide to Illustration. So thank you very much, Jeremy.
Cool. Thanks, Flynn, and thanks for all the questions, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye, everyone. See you later.